The date was a Tuesday, late in the evening of an otherwise unremarkable day in the Caribbean Sea. No one on the bridge of the USS Gonzalez, an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, anticipated the horror that was about to unfold. The sea, usually an ally of peace in a vast canvas of blue, was about to become a grave. This was not a drill. This was the precipice of a blood-soaked nightmare. A sudden and brutal thrust into a conflict that few believed was possible. The air was thick with the suffocating humidity of the tropics, but an infinitely colder atmosphere was descending upon the crew. The USS Gonzalez was conducting what was termed a freedom of navigation transit, a routine yet politically charged operation that saw them skirting the Venezuelan maritime boundary. The tensions between the two nations were not new, yet the military-grade escalation that began at 23:14 hours that night was entirely unprecedented, a catastrophic departure from the unspoken rules of international engagement. At first, the radar image was so ambiguous, so quiet, that the junior officer logging the contact dismissed it as an atmospheric anomaly, a low, barely perceptible electronic signature that blinked on the screen for a mere second before vanishing. But in the deep-sea chess match that is modern naval operations, a single second is a lifetime. The veteran sonar chief, a man with 20 years of the sea's whispers in his blood, felt a prickle of intuition, that cold, unmistakable signal that something fundamentally wrong was approaching from the deep. He hit the button to amplify the submerged acoustics. What followed was a sound that would forever be etched into the minds of the bridge crew, the high-pitched, insistent whine of a high-speed projectile in the water. The chief's voice, usually calm and methodical, cracked with the sudden, terrifying urgency of a man staring into the void. Torpedoes. Torpedoes in the water. 6 inbound, bearing 045. In that single agonizing moment, a flash of light and sound, the quiet routine of a naval patrol evaporated. This was the silent invasion, the stealthy assassination attempt aimed at a sovereign warship. The captain, Commander Elias Thorne, a man known for his calculated calm, didn't hesitate. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the core that this was the moment of no return. 6 torpedoes, 6 steel and explosive monsters, each one carrying enough force to break the spine of the powerful destroyer, were racing through the dark water. The ship's automated defense system screamed to life, a cacophony of urgent alarms and electronic warnings that seemed to mock the crew with their futility. The time from initial detection to potential impact was estimated at under 45 seconds. 45 seconds to decide the fate of 300 souls. The bridge became a scene of controlled chaos. Orders were barked out with a desperate precision that only years of training could impart. The ship violently heeled to port as the helmsman threw the massive vessel into an evasive maneuver, an act of sheer will against the unforgiving laws of physics and hydrodynamics. Hard to port, all engines ahead full. Commander Thorne's voice sliced through the din, but even he knew that a destroyer, for all its power, could not simply dance out of the way of 6 smart-homing torpedoes in such close quarters. The desperate, nauseating list of the ship was the first taste of the destruction to come. Down in the engineering spaces, the engine crew, the unsung heroes of every naval tragedy, wrestled with the steam lines and turbines, pushing the ship past its design limits, knowing full well they were driving a target into the line of fire. They were driving a massive steel vessel, a symbol of national power, into a maelstrom of destruction, all while waiting for the inevitable, cataclysmic impact. This was the end of peace. This was the beginning of an unthinkable, horrifying war. The frantic dash of the USS Gonzalez was a beautiful, yet futile, dance against fate. Every anti-torpedo measure was deployed in an agonizing, desperate hope. Countermeasures were launched. Electronic noise was pumped into the water, and the ship's powerful engines roared a deafening protest. Yet, the physics of underwater combat are brutal and unforgiving. The sonar chief's voice, a grim oracle of doom, delivered the impossible, soul-crushing updates. 2 evaded, 4 holding course. Impact in 10 seconds. The number 6 torpedoes, initially a terrifying figure, had been whittled down, but the remaining 4 were still too many. Down below the waterline, the crew waited in terrifying silence, bracing for a blow that would instantly rip apart their world. The first impact, at 23:15 and 02 seconds, was a concussive shockwave that felt less like an explosion and more like the very ocean floor had risen up to deliver a punch of unimaginable force. The entire 8,300-ton ship shuddered, a massive beast recoiling in pain. In the control room, lights flickered violently, plunging the compartment into a strobe-like chaos of emergency lighting and sparks. The horrifying, unmistakable sound of rending metal was instantly followed by the high-pressure hiss of seawater flooding the deep recesses of the hull. Compartment 2, 3, 4, 5. Flooding. Losing power to the aft rudder. The damage control officer's voice was a strained, hollow cry of profound loss. The second impact, barely 5 seconds later, was even more catastrophic. It struck closer to the main engine room, a blow that silenced the thunder of the main turbines, replacing it with the sickening gurgle of a fatally wounded ship. The power grid, the very nervous system of the destroyer, failed instantly. The USS Gonzalez was now a drifting, dying hulk. The captain's chair became a throne of grief, surrounded by the horrifying reality of the attack. "Casualty reports, give me casualty reports." Thorne's voice was hoarse, thick with the smoke and the overwhelming stench of oil, blood, and fear. The initial reports were a litany of horror that no sailor should ever have to deliver. The entire aft section was structurally compromised, virtually ripped away from the main body. The loss of life was catastrophic, particularly in the lower decks where the rapid flooding had left no time for escape. The engineering spaces, the heart of the ship, were a tomb. The Venezuelan attack was not merely a military incident, it was an act of cold-blooded, brutal massacre. The wounded destroyer, listing heavily and shrouded in an oily black smoke, was now a monument to the price of unprovoked aggression. The crew who remained alive were now confronted with a tragedy of unthinkable magnitude. 300 young souls had embarked on this routine journey. Now, only half remained, many trapped in the icy grip of the flooding water, their last moments a desperate, silent battle against the unstoppable force of the sea. The pain, the overwhelming grief, was a tidal wave washing over the few survivors. This single brazen act of war had turned a routine patrol into a heartbreaking story of profound loss. The captain's decision was not one of tactics, but of vengeance, a pure, unadulterated, and immediate response to the horror that had just unfolded beneath his feet. Commander Thorne did not wait for approval, did not wait for political maneuvering, and did not wait for the inevitable diplomatic theater. His warship was sinking, his crew was dead, and his heart was a cold, hard stone of righteous fury. The code of naval warfare, the sacred duty to his fallen men, demanded an instant counterstrike. This was not merely about survival, it was about delivering a message written in fire and steel. There is a price for innocent blood, and that price is paid in full, immediately. Despite the catastrophic damage, the destroyer's combat system, the formidable Aegis system, was designed for exactly this kind of devastating, asymmetrical blow. The remaining system was running on auxiliary power, its digital brain working at a fever pitch, compiling the attack data. The fire control solution was instantaneous, and it was lethal. The captain's command, delivered with the terrifying calm of a man who has already lost everything, was final. Target confirmed hostile submarine. Engage with ASROC. Full spread. The counterstrike was the agonizing, blood-soaked roar of a mortally wounded beast. The shock and awe of the American response was the precise, surgical ferocity that its military was known for. Before the oil-slicked sea could even calm from the torpedo explosions, the USS Gonzalez unleashed its anti-submarine capability. The Vertical Launch Anti-Submarine Rocket, ASROC. 2 seconds after the captain's order, a massive plume of white-hot smoke erupted from the destroyer's forward VLS cells. The ASROC missiles, each carrying a high-explosive payload, tore into the night sky, their trajectory an unswerving path to the hidden Venezuelan submarine that had fired the lethal barrage. This was the embodiment of modern, high-speed, networked naval combat, detection, identification, and terminal engagement, all transpiring within less than 1 minute. The Venezuelan submarine, having executed its brazen attack, had foolishly lingered for mere seconds to confirm the kill. Those few seconds were its final, fatal mistake. The first ASROC warhead detonated with a thunderous roar directly over the submerged target, creating a massive, localized hydrostatic shockwave, the lethal underwater hammer blow that instantly crushed the hull of the submarine like a tin can. The sea, which had been the killer's sanctuary, instantly became its crushing tomb. The devastating counterstrike was a complete and utter annihilation. There were no survivors, no prisoners, and no possibility of rescue. The Venezuelan sub and its entire crew vanished instantly, replaced by a momentary, silent bubble of wreckage and debris that quickly sank into the abyssal depths. The loss of life on the Venezuelan side was also complete, a stark, tragic mirror to the devastation on the American destroyer. Revenge, swift and absolute, had been delivered. But the price for both nations, the immediate, heartbreaking loss of life on both sides of the unprovoked attack, was a profound tragedy that would forever overshadow the technical brilliance of the counterstrike. This sudden, short-lived, and brutal naval exchange became a devastating footnote in the history of naval warfare, a terrifying reminder of the speed and utter finality of combat at sea. The cost of those reckless 6 torpedoes was a shared, irreversible destruction. The silence that followed the counterstrike was more chilling than the earlier explosions. It was the silence of utter, final destruction. The USS Gonzalez, a proud warship built to withstand the fury of the sea and the malice of man, was now a fractured, burning ruin. Commander Thorne stood on the listing bridge, the acrid stench of cordite and burning oil filling his nostrils. The only sound, the sickening groan of stressed metal and the relentless rush of water into the hull. The immediate danger of the enemy was gone, but the ghost of massacre was everywhere. The tragedy was not the sinking of the ship, but the lives lost, the young sailors, the seasoned veterans, the 300 souls whose futures were now scattered across the dark waves. The true horror of the incident, which occurred just off the Venezuelan coast, was the profound human cost. The loss of life was heartbreaking, and the emotional toll on the survivors was immeasurable. The men who had endured the blast and the flooding now worked in a desperate, shell-shocked daze, their movements slow and agonizing, driven only by the sheer, cold will to survive. Damage control parties, fighting the relentless intrusion of the sea, moved through the dark, twisted wreckage, wading through the chaos, calling out names that would never be answered, a truly devastating, hopeless search for those who were already swallowed by the water. The political fallout was immediate and explosive. The incident, a brazen act of war on the high seas, instantly shattered the fragile peace between the nations. International condemnation rained down, but the Venezuelan government, predictably, denied all knowledge, calling the event an unprovoked American aggression, a cynical lie that twisted the very knife of the tragedy. Yet, the electronic evidence, the recovered fragments of the Venezuelan torpedoes, and the acoustic signature of the sunken submarine were undeniable, concrete proof of their brutal, reckless act. For the American Navy, the incident became a cold, hard lesson in the terrifying new realities of naval warfare. The enemy, small and desperate, had not respected the established rules of engagement. They had struck without warning, with devastating, calculated brutality. The official report from Commander Thorne, delivered from the deck of his sinking command, was not a plea for rescue, but a screaming indictment of the price of complacency. The final image of the USS Gonzalez was not one of glory, but of profound, tragic loss. The destroyer, its proud flag still flying despite the tilt and the smoke, was slowly abandoned, the survivors being rescued by a massive international fleet that converged on the scene. The ship sank at 3:40 hours the following morning, carrying its dead and its terrible secret into the depths, leaving behind a massive, oily scar on the tranquil surface of the Caribbean. The story of the USS Gonzalez is now a haunting legend whispered in the mess halls of the American fleet, a chilling, perpetual reminder of the tragic cost of those reckless 6 torpedoes and the heartbreaking loss of life in the silent, terrifying depths of the sea. The true tragedy of the Venezuelan torpedo attack was not the loss of a multi-billion-dollar warship. It was the shattering of lives and the destruction of hope. The sea, often romanticized in naval lore, had become a merciless entity, swallowing young men and women who had sworn an oath to protect it. The Venezuelan strike was not against steel, but against flesh and blood, tearing apart families, dreams, and the very fabric of the lives that touched the crew of the USS Gonzalez. The profound loss of life, the sheer, brutal finality of the tragedy, sent an agonizing shockwave across the nation. The image of the destroyer sinking was one thing, but the aftermath of the casualty reports was a horror entirely its own. On docks across the country, families waited in agonizing silence for news that, for too many, never arrived. The devastation was intensely personal. The young radio man who had just sent a letter home to his new bride, the seasoned chief petty officer planning his retirement, the young engineer whose brilliance was extinguished in the dark, suffocating depths of the engine room, each life was a world, now utterly lost. The Counterstrike, though hailed as a military necessity, brought no real comfort. Revenge, instant and total, had merely doubled the tragedy, compounding the grief with the knowledge of equal, mirrored loss on the Venezuelan vessel. The two countries, separated by a sea of escalating hostility, now shared an agonizing bond of shared devastation, a terrifying lesson in the quick, lethal finality of modern combat. The lives lost on both sides were a profound, unbearable price paid for the reckless political maneuverings of their leaders. The sailors who survived the ordeal carried the war not in their hands, but in their minds a heavy, silent burden of survivors' guilt and trauma. They were the ghosts of the Gonzalez, forever haunted by the sounds of the rending metal, the screams of the trapped, and the chilling silence that followed. Their war had not ended with the Counterstrike. It had merely begun, a silent, internal conflict against the terrifying memories of the sea's betrayal and the brutal loss of their comrades. The legacy of the incident is one of unadulterated sorrow. The sinking of the USS Gonzalez served as a grim, brutal turning point in the international military landscape, a moment when the comfortable illusion of peace shattered. It became a permanent, visceral reminder that war at sea is not fought by machines, but by men, and that the true cost of conflict is always measured in the heartbreak of the lost. The story is a harrowing testament to the devastating human cost of a single, reckless, and unforgivable military decision. The names of the lost are now inscribed in a wall of remembrance, a permanent memorial to the sheer, brutal tragedy of the sea and the agonizing, profound loss of 300 souls. The investigation that followed the sinking revealed a final, agonizing layer to the tragedy: the initial, subtle electronic signature detected by the junior officer. It was a failed warning, a ghost in the machine that was dismissed as a glitch. That single second of hesitation, that single moment of misjudgment in the complexity of modern warfare, became the difference between evasion and annihilation. The terrifying truth was that the destroyer had been blinded by complacency, a fatal error born not of incompetence, but of the routine, monotonous nature of their long patrol. The Venezuelan submarine had exploited this human element, this reliance on routine, with devastating efficiency. The failure to recognize the imminent threat was a brutal, self-inflicted wound, compounding the devastation of the Venezuelan attack. The acoustic analysis later confirmed that the low signature was indeed the Venezuelan sub's pre-launch positioning, a signature that should have triggered a Level 1 full alert status, but it didn't. The crew, tired and far from the heat of actual combat, made a fatal assumption of security. This single mistake, a tiny, almost imperceptible blip on a radar screen, was the trigger for the unthinkable tragedy. The captain, Commander Thorne, though praised for his instantaneous and decisive counterstrike, was forever burdened by the knowledge of this failed warning. The lives of his crew had been placed in his hands, and the weight of their loss was a crushingly heavy, unbearable load. The survivors, the men and women now fighting their own internal, silent war against trauma and grief, were bound together by a shattered trust. The trust in technology, the trust in protocol, and the agonizing trust in the certainty of safety. They had seen firsthand that the ocean is a terrifying place, and that the rules of engagement are only as reliable as the humanity of those who uphold them. The final, devastating chapter of the USS Gonzalez incident was the cold, official post-mortem. It was a stark, uncompromising report that confirmed the obvious. The 6 torpedoes were a deliberate, unprovoked act of extreme military aggression. Yet, the report also detailed the internal failures, the fatigue, the missed signature, the fatal complacency. The loss of life, the massive, heartbreaking destruction, was not just the enemy's victory, it was a deeply ingrained, agonizing reminder of the price of human error in the age of instantaneous, devastating naval combat. The incident left a dark, indelible stain on the history of both navies, a terrifying legacy of sorrow, vengeance, and a profound, irreversible shattering of trust. The ocean, which had once represented freedom, was now the eternal resting place of the lost, a chilling reminder of the utter finality of war. The echoes of the Venezuelan torpedo attack were not merely political, they were acoustical and emotional, reverberating through the lives of everyone connected to the USS Gonzalez. The ocean, once a source of pride, now represented a massive, unforgiving, unending grief. Every wave, every distant foghorn, every whisper of the wind was a painful reminder of the terrifying night and the brutal, unforgivable loss. The survivors, repatriated to a world that could not possibly understand their silent horror, were left with a devastating, solitary burden, the knowledge of what they had endured, and the agonizing guilt of those they could not save. The military funeral was a spectacle of solemn, unadulterated pain. The thousands of empty chairs, representing the sheer scale of the loss, were a stark, visceral tableau of the tragedy. Taps, played with a heartbreaking finality, seemed to mark not just the end of lives, but the shattering of an entire generation's innocence about the nature of modern warfare. The families, tear-stained and broken, held tightly to folded flags and fragmented memories, their private, individual grief magnified by the cruel, impersonal reality of the unprovoked attack. This was not a heroic death in a declared war. This was a massacre, a brutal, sudden termination of hope and life. The political denial from the Venezuelan government, their brazen insistence on innocence, served only to deepen the wounds. It was a cynical act of psychological warfare that tried to erase the reality of the loss, to deny the families even the cold comfort of an acknowledged enemy. The survivors, those who had seen the torpedo wakes and heard the final, agonizing screams, became unwilling witnesses in a geopolitical theater, their trauma reduced to evidence in a legalistic argument about the price of unprovoked aggression. The final, agonizing legacy of the USS Gonzalez incident is the permanent scar it left on the American Navy's psyche. It became a symbol of vulnerability, a brutal, terrifying demonstration that even the most advanced and powerful warship could be brought down by a single, determined, and reckless act of malice. The loss of life was a catastrophic lesson taught in the most brutal of classrooms, the dark, silent depths of the Caribbean Sea. The grief was a tidal wave, washing over the fleet, reminding every sailor of the terrifying fragility of their lives and the immense, terrifying power of the cold, hard steel that races through the water. The agonizing echoes of the explosions and the subsequent silence will forever haunt the memories of the American fleet, a terrible, profound reminder of the unending cost of a single, unforgivable act of war. The sinking of the USS Gonzalez and the simultaneous annihilation of the Venezuelan submarine marked a terrifying, unprecedented tragedy of escalation. The 6 torpedoes fired by a single, desperate, and reckless hand instantly transformed a political standoff into a brutal, bloody conflict, a terrifying demonstration of how quickly the rules of engagement can be shattered and replaced by pure, visceral, uncontrolled destruction. The sea had been the stage for a short, brutal, and horrifying act of mutual annihilation. The loss of life on both sides became the legacy of blood, a devastating, symmetrical tragedy that underscored the sheer, raw, and unforgiving nature of modern naval warfare. The Venezuelan government, having paid an immediate and catastrophic price for its aggression, was left reeling, its reputation permanently stained by the undeniable evidence of the unprovoked attack. The world watched in stunned silence, realizing that the old rules of engagement were dead, replaced by a terrifying new reality, where first strike means final strike. For the American fleet, the incident triggered an immediate, devastating, and relentless reevaluation of its defense posture. The terrifying vulnerability of its most advanced warship, exposed in a single, brutal minute of combat, demanded an instant, uncompromising overhaul of its anti-torpedo and early detection systems. The lessons of the Gonzalez were taught not with textbooks, but with the agonizing weight of its lost crew, a grim, silent, and permanent reminder that vigilance must be absolute and that complacency is a death sentence. The surviving crew members, the few who bore witness to the terrifying, brutal finality of the attack, became a fraternity of the damned, bound forever by the trauma of the sinking and the horrifying knowledge of the men they could not save. Their journey back to an emotional normalcy was an internal war, a silent, unending struggle against the ghosts of the deep and the crushing weight of their memories. The image of their sinking warship and the cries of their dying comrades became a permanent, agonizing echo in the recesses of their minds. The true, permanent impact of those reckless 6 torpedoes was the shattering of the belief in a contained, controlled conflict. It was the cold, hard, and undeniable proof that in the dark, silent depths of the sea, an act of unprovoked aggression will be met with an instant, devastating, and equally brutal counterstrike, leaving behind only the wreckage of steel and the unending, agonizing grief of the lost. The tragedy of the Gonzalez will forever stand as a monument to the terrifying cost of a single, reckless, and unforgivable act of war. The few who made it off the sinking USS Gonzalez were left with a trauma that transcended physical wounds, the survivor's curse. They were the unwilling carriers of a horrifying truth, the knowledge that their friends, their comrades, the men and women they served with, had died a brutal, terrifying death in the cold, unforgiving dark. The counterstrike, though an act of justified vengeance, brought no solace, only a profound, numbing silence that mirrored the instantaneous annihilation of the Venezuelan crew. This terrible, shared devastation became the agonizing burden carried by the few who lived. The investigation, cold and clinical, focused on the tactical details, the failure of the initial sensor contact, and the overwhelming effectiveness of the immediate counterstrike. But the human element, the sheer, brutal devastation of the loss, was too vast to be contained in any official report. The survivors were forced to relive the horror, their testimonies a raw, agonizing chronicle of the last moments of their ship and their comrades. They spoke of the unbearable fear, the sound of rending metal, the high-pressure hiss of the flooding water, and the final, crushing silence that descended over the destroyer. Their truth, the raw, unfiltered account of the massacre, was a stark counterpoint to the political denial from Caracas. The Venezuelan government's cynical attempt to label the event as American aggression was a cruel, final insult to the memory of the lost. The survivors, holding the undeniable evidence of their trauma, became the unwavering, agonizing guardians of the truth, their very existence, a living, breathing testament to the brutal, unforgivable attack. They were the men and women who knew the real cost of those 6 torpedoes. The weight of the truth was a crippling force. They had lived while their friends had died. They had seen the enemy annihilated, yet the revenge brought no peace. The terrifying, agonizing realization was that the war never truly ended. It simply changed theaters, moving from the open sea to the silent, private recesses of their minds. The USS Gonzalez was gone, sunk to the depths, but the devastating ghost of the loss remained, forever haunting the quiet moments of the survivors, a permanent, chilling reminder of the brutal, final, and profound cost of the 6 torpedoes. The loss of life was an irreversible scar on their souls, a terrible, agonizing testament to the quick, brutal devastation of naval combat. The tragedy of the USS Gonzalez was, in the end of innocence for an entire generation of sailors. The comfortable, long-held illusion of American naval invulnerability was shattered, replaced by the cold, hard, and brutal reality of the unprovoked asymmetrical attack. The Venezuelan strike was a terrifying reminder that in the interconnected, high-stakes world of modern geopolitics, no one is truly safe, and that the line between peace and devastating, outright war is terrifyingly thin. The most enduring image of the disaster is not the fire or the sinking, but the massive, heart-wrenching loss of life. The 300 souls who perished, the profound, agonizing devastation they left behind, became the eternal scar on the American national memory. The Venezuelan crew, though the aggressors, were also lost, and their families, too, were left with the cold, hard weight of an immediate, terrible, and final loss. The shared devastation of the 2 ships, the USS Gonzalez and the unnamed Venezuelan submarine, became a dark, chilling symbol of the futility and the unbearable, immediate cost of a single, reckless act of military aggression. The tragedy demanded a reckoning, a profound reevaluation of the rules of engagement, and a stark, uncompromising look at the limits of technology. The instant counterstrike was a demonstration of military capability, but the initial vulnerability was the terrifying lesson. The loss of life was the price paid for that lesson. The naval doctrine was instantly rewritten, not in the comfortable quiet of an office, but in the traumatic, heartbreaking chaos of the sinking destroyer. The USS Gonzalez, now a silent, metallic tomb at the bottom of the Caribbean, will forever stand as a chilling, profound monument to the lost. Its story is an agonizing, inescapable narrative about the swift, total, and irreversible devastation of naval combat. The 6 torpedoes fired by Venezuela were not just an act of war, they were a dagger thrust into the heart of the illusion of peace, leaving behind a legacy of blood, sorrow, and the eternal, agonizing scar of profound loss. The profound sadness of the story lies in the sheer, brutal finality of the devastation. The lost crew, the sunk vessels, and the shattering of the innocence that the sea was once considered a place of safety.